Perfect. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute. My name is Caitlin McCarthy, and I'm the Director of the Associates Program here at ELI. You have joined us for the Basics of the Clean Air Act, part of ELI's annual summer school series. We're delighted to welcome everyone here today in person and online, and I encourage you to follow the events page on our website, eli.org. For our audience members on GoToWebinar, we encourage you to ask a question by entering it through GoTo's question box, and please do not hold them until the end. Send them as soon as you think of them. For our audience in the room, we'll pass around this microphone for questions at the end. I'd like to thank our wonderful panel for being here with us today to teach the many applications and facets of the Clean Air Act. A recording and the PowerPoints of today's seminar will be available on our website within the next week. Full speaker bios are available on our website, but I would like to take a moment to introduce our outstanding panel. So first we have Phil Osmus, who's the Senior Staff Associate at the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. Previously in private practice, Phil was also formerly a volunteer attorney with a legal services group in Massachusetts, a legal fellow in the Massachusetts Office of the Governor's Legal Counsel, and worked for former U.S. Representative Stephanie Herseth Sandlin. He received his BA in Physics, Math, and Computer Science from Luther College, a Master's in Physics from the University of Oxford, and his JD from Harvard Law School. Thanks for joining us, Phil. Janet McCabe is joining us on the web. She is a Senior Law Fellow at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, as well as a Professor of Practice at Indiana University's Robert H. McKinney School of Law. And she is the Assistant Director for Policy and Implementation at the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. Janet was formerly the Acting Assistant Administrator in the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA. She works to advance policies to better protect healthy, clean air and our environment. She received both her BA and her JD from Harvard. Welcome, Janet. And Peter Whitfield is counsel at Sidley Austin. He has extensive knowledge of the Clean Air Act and previously was an environmental lawyer at a large international law firm where he represented clients in a variety of industries. He also litigated as a trial attorney with the Department of Justice's Natural Resources section. Peter received his BA from Duke University and his JD from the University of Hawaii's William S. Richardson School of Law. Glad you could join us, Peter. So with that, I'll turn things over to Peter to get us started today.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. So the Clean Air Act is an incredibly complex statute, and you could spend probably an entire year teaching everything that's contained within the Act. But today we're going to just try and give you a very brief overview, some of the basics, and then probably some more details of the more interesting aspects of the Clean Air Act. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of the background, then turn it over to Janet, and Janet will teach you the acronym-laden portions of the statute. I think she's going to talk about the NAAQS, SIPs, NSPS, NESHAPs, probably PSD, CASPER. All these things she'll make very clear to you guys. And then we'll turn back to me for a brief discussion of the Renewable Fuel Standard, and then Phil's going to tackle GHG regulation. All right. So how did we get to the modern Clean Air Act? It didn't happen overnight, and arguably there are a number of failures along the way. So we started out in 1955 with the Air Pollution Control Act. This was the very first federal legislation involving air pollution. The act provided funds for federal research in air pollution, no teeth to this, and it did not address all of the problems that the United States was starting to see. At this time, you got to think a little bit about what was going on in the world. The 50s, there were lots of air pollution issues. There was the Great Smog of London in 1952. You had weather conditions where there was no wind, there was an anticyclone, and there was a lot of air pollution from nearby power plants, and it formed severe fog with high sulfur dioxide concentrations, and it resulted in a tremendous amount of illnesses and fatalities. For those of you who watch The Crown on Netflix, they've got one episode where they kind of show a little bit of what that was like. New York and various parts of the United States experienced similar events. New York actually, I think, had three, one in 53, one in 63, and another one in 66, where you ended up having hundreds of deaths. I think Pennsylvania and LA had tremendous fog issues too. And all of these events started to raise attention by the public and created a need to start implementing some regulations. So then we get the Clean Air Act of 1963. And this act added a little bit. So you get additional research and grant programs. You've got a direction to address interstate air pollution. And this was, I believe, in 63. This is the first time that the federal government conducted ambient monitoring studies, as well as stationary source inspections. This act was designed to be regional in nature. And the idea was that you would designate air quality regions throughout the country, and then states were given the responsibilities for adopting and enforcing pollution control measures. This act was not without controversy. There are a lot of folks who looked at it and said, you can't regulate air regionally. Air pollution doesn't stop at defined boundaries. It can go just about anywhere, so we need more of a national focus. And then the other side said, no, a lot of these problems are regional. Let's address it on a regional basis. All right, so then the regional approach actually didn't work. So now we get to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970. One of the reasons with the previous approach is by 1970, there were fewer than 36 air quality regions designated, and there was a need to establish somewhere around 100. So we fell way short of the goals. And there wasn't a single state that had developed a full pollution control program. So now you've got pollution, you've got a big Earth Day movement, and now we end up with the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970. All right, so interesting fact, President Nixon signed the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970. There are, I guess, arguably the two most important elements of this statute. Established national ambient air quality standards and statutory deadlines for compliance. So now you've got the national standards, now you've got deadlines and a clear direction to go forward. I think the EPA actually started right around this time as well. During this time, Congress was working to convince the public that both economic growth and clean air could go hand in hand. I think that was a really difficult concept for a lot of people to grasp at that time. And I was reviewing some articles on the history, and in one of the articles that I read the other day, there was a recap of a House debate when this was being debated. And I think one member of Congress said, if you want a town to grow, it has to stink. So I think we've significantly evolved from that line of thinking, and there are probably not too many people today that could get elected with that type of a message. So the Clean Air Act, it was targeted primarily at reducing emissions of common criteria pollutants that were presumed to be responsible for widespread pollution. The core provisions of the Clean Air Act are in Title I. It requires the EPA to identify pollutants that, in its judgment, cause or contribute to air pollution and that may endanger public health or welfare. And so they have to set national standards for those, which are NACs. And they have to set those standards at levels that are adequate to protect the public health and welfare. And then the states and EPA were required to collect data on ambient air quality for each of the pollutants for which you have a national air standard. And you have to classify the regions of the country based on whether those regions are in attainment or not in attainment with those standards. And so once an area is classified, responsibility for meeting the standards rests primarily with the states, and they've got to adopt state implementation plans, or SIPs. And the SIPs will specify measures that the states need to implement in order to achieve and maintain compliance with the NACs. All right, so what are some of the other titles of the Clean Air Act as it is today? So Title I, we think of primarily as regulating stationary sources. You've got air quality planning, prevention of significant deterioration, non-attainment issues, new source performance standards, air toxics, enforcement, a lot of that stuff Janet's going to go into in more detail. Title II are your mobile sources, which is essentially your engines. I believe a good way to think about it is an engine it's not going to be in the same place for more than a year. There's some general provisions in Title III. And Title IV, you've got both noise pollution regulation in the acid rain program. Title V are your operating permits for stationary sources, and then Title VI is the stratospheric ozone protection. Okay, so basic structure, Title I. So Title I, and again, Janet's going to talk about this in more detail, but Title I details the process of setting air quality standards and maintaining them if an area is in attainment, and meeting them or achieving them if an area is not in attainment. Additionally, there are provisions governing emissions controls for stationary sources. You've got performance requirements by source category, which are your new source performance standards. You've got requirements to control air toxics or hazardous air pollution, hazardous air pollutants, and then you have enforcement provisions as well. Okay, so new source performance standards. These are technology-based standards that limit emissions by a category. So if you think of an oil refinery, for example, they may be regulated by subpart JA, but they're targeted by categories. And the new source performance standards can apply whether or not you are a major source or an area source. And I think Janet will go into that in more detail too. But generally for some of the permitting programs, it only applies to a major source. So if you're above a certain threshold of air pollutant emissions per year, and if you're under that, you can be considered an area source. So the air toxics provision, they also regulate major and area sources. I think we've designated well over 100 hazardous air pollutants that are regulated. Okay. Title II are your mobile sources. Under Title II, EPA regulates essentially almost every part of a combustion engine. They set standards for engines. They regulate the types of fuel that powers those engines. They can set fuel efficiency standards. So it's almost everything that's mobile. A quick question for everybody in the audience to think about the difference between Title I and Title II. If you were to permanently install a series of generators powered by diesel engines, would you think that they're regulated under Title I stationary sources or Title II mobile? So if you think Title I, raise your hand. And Title II? All right, we're split. So these are generally regulated under Title I because they're permanently installed and they're not going to move for more than a year. So generally when you think about engines in that type of category, they fall more towards your Title I regulation. Okay, other programs. So in Title III, there are enforcement provisions as well as some general definitions. Like Title IV is noise pollution. 4A is the acid rain program. I think this is the first instance where EPA essentially put in a cap and trade system for regulating sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. Title V are the operating permits, the idea being that EPA's created a way to put all of your air pollution control requirements into a single document. So a Title V will have a whole bunch of different air requirements and should be the one place that you can look to see what the emissions limitations are for a source. And then Title VI are the stratospheric ozone protections, which regulate your CFCs, HCFCs, and other substances that have an impact on stratospheric ozone. Okay, one of the biggest elements of the Clean Air Act is the requirement to set national ambient air quality standards. These are numeric standards for each of the criteria pollutants, and there are 6 of them. And the purpose of these standards are to protect public health and to allow a margin of safety. The standards are expressed in terms of the maximum acceptable mass, or micrograms per cubic meter, for a period of time. Could be a 1-hour standard, a 24-hour standard, or there could be a concentration-based limit, which is generally expressed as parts per million. When setting the NAAQS, EPA cannot consider the costs of the controls required to achieve those levels. And as you'll see later today, the cost element comes in at very different times. So if you're setting maximum achievable control technology requirements, you can consider cost. NAAQS, you can't. And you can consider uncertain science and also provide for a margin of safety. So they don't necessarily have to be exact. If there's a little bit of uncertainty, EPA has the discretion to put in a buffer zone. All right, so what are the criteria pollutants? First one we'll talk about is particulate matter. Particulate matter is essentially small, fine particles, and if you see in the parenthetical here, there are 3 categories. There's particulate matter that's just general. PM10 and PM2.5 reference the size of the particles. So PM10 would be a particle that's 10 micrometers and smaller, and PM2.5 are 2.5 micrometers and smaller. So if you think about PM10, those are essentially your inhalable particles. And PM2.5 is designated separately because they're your fine inhalable particles, and that may have different health consequences. Most of you probably don't know how big a micrometer is. So PM2.5 would be a particle that's about as wide as a strand of hair. All right, well, we're not quite there yet. So where does PM come from? It originates from a variety of man-made and mobile sources, as well as from natural sources. So you can have it from combustion, you can have it from dust, construction sites. You get unpaved roads, fields, sometimes trees are emitters of particulate matter. Smokestacks, fires, of wide variety of sources. Some of them aren't necessarily emitted directly from combustion. They can be a result of secondary formation when you get chemicals that go up into the atmosphere, and then they combine to form particulate matter later on. All right. So what are the health effects of particulate matter? These depend on a variety of different factors. So the fine particles that can be easily inhaled can get stuck in your lungs, and they can cause respiratory symptoms and other problems. And what are the environmental effects? So it depends on the concentration, right? So here you see 2 different pictures, one on the left and one on the right. On the left, the ambient air level for particulate matter is about 15 micrograms per cubic meter, and on the right you've got one that's about 3 times as much. And so you can see the difference in visibility. It also can cause environmental damage depending on the chemical qualities of the particulate matter. All right, carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas that's formed when fuel is not burned completely. More than half of the carbon monoxide emissions in the United States come from vehicle exhaust, with the remainder emitted by non-road engines and vehicles and industrial processes and other sources. Unlike ozone, carbon monoxide is primarily a problem during cold weather, whereas ozone, you end up having a higher concentration during the summertime. Because of at colder temperatures, you get more incomplete combustion. All right, in terms of the health effects, at low concentrations, carbon monoxide exposure can cause fatigue in healthy people and chest pain with people with heart disease. At very high concentrations, inhalation can be fatal. All right, and we'll talk about nitrogen dioxide and ozone together because generally they're associated with each other. So nitrogen dioxide is one of a family of nitrogen oxide gases that are formed when fuel is burned at a high temperature. So think of the opposite cause from carbon monoxide. Ozone, and we think here this is ground level or bad as ozone. So this isn't atmospheric ozone, this is ground level. This is created by chemical reactions between oxides of nitrogen and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, in the presence of sunlight. So you can see why during the summertime ozone is more of a problem than in the wintertime, because you get a lot more sunlight. So how do we deal with these types of pollutants? So over the course of time, we've had engines that have become more fuel efficient, so you end up with lower nitrogen dioxide emissions, better design control technologies that limit nitrogen oxide emissions. And if you think of nitrogen in general, that's what most of our atmosphere is made up of. I think somewhere around 78% of our atmosphere is molecular nitrogen, which is just N2. And then it ends up forming into nitrogen dioxide at high temperatures. When that molecular bond is broken, you end up with two separate nitrogens that end up being highly reactive, and they'll react with the oxygen in the combustion process, and that's how you form NO, NO2, NO3, and NO4, and those we generally refer to as NOx. And I think I mentioned the primary sources of NOx emissions are motor vehicles, electric utilities, industrial, commercial, and residential sources that burn fossil fuel. Okay, your health effects. For ozone is very reactive and it can oxidize your lung tissue. This can cause lung damage. It can lead to cardiovascular and respiratory problems. So they're pretty significant effects. Most of you may know from watching the news or Weather Channel, they'll have high and low ozone days that encourage you to not do a lot of stuff outside on the bad days. And then in terms of environmental effects, you get a lot of smog. All right. I'll tell you a little bit more about the environmental effects. So most smog, I believe, is caused by ozone. And it's a result of the ozone forming from sunlight and nitrogen oxide interactions. One thing to keep in mind is that nitrogen oxide is considered a precursor for ozone. That'll come up in a various number of regulatory issues under the Clean Air Act, and it's one of the reasons why we regulate it. Okay. Sulfur dioxide. So sulfur dioxide is like NOx. It's one of a family of sulfur oxide gases that are emitted during the processing of materials that contain sulfur. So it's found in, sulfur's found in fossil fuels, it's found in like coal and oil, as well as in certain common metals. And so sulfur oxide gases are formed when fuel containing sulfur is burned or when metals or fuels are extracted. Some of the health effects, the short-term exposure to sulfur dioxide can harm the respiratory system, and it can make breathing difficult. Children and the elderly are especially susceptible to exposure to sulfur dioxide. And the environmental effects, so one of the issues with sulfur dioxide is that it can go up into the atmosphere, it dissolves easily with water, and you end up with acid rain. And in general, sulfur dioxide can also cause harm to trees and other plants. There's also an issue with sulfur dioxide causing regional haze, and I think Janet will go into that in more detail. All right, our last criteria pollutant is lead. Most of the lead that's emitted in the United States is a result of emissions from automobiles, back when they used to add lead to gasoline. I think lead was the first and only pollutant to be added through the petition process as a result of litigation. So this was one of the ones that that NRDC was helpful in putting together as a criteria pollutant. I think we removed lead from our gasoline sometime in the mid-1970s. It was also a common component in a lot of industrial and commercial products. So now that it's no longer in gasoline, the primary source of lead is metal smelting, and I don't think we have any primary lead smelters in the United States anymore. So most of it comes from secondary lead smelting. So the highest concentrations of lead in the United States are generally found around these types of facilities. In terms of health and environmental effects, the problem with lead is that it persists in the environment for a long time. It accumulates in soils and sediments, also in air. And depending on exposure and the quantity of lead, you can have some negative effects to a lot of your bodily systems. Your nervous system can be damaged, kidney function, cardiovascular system, and it's also a particular issue for exposure to children because it can impact brain development. All right, and with that, we'll turn it over to Janet.
Thanks, Peter. Here I am, seeing you all. So thanks for joining this seminar, and I think Peter's done a great job of giving a very high overview. As has been mentioned already, you could do multiple law school classes, year-long, semester-long law school classes on so many of these topics, and I do that at the McKinney Law School in Indiana. It's hard to fit everything in, so I'm going to go down one level of detail from many of the issues that Peter has mentioned, and he's going to helpfully move my slides for me. The first thing I wanted to do, though, was to talk about a couple of underlying principles or themes that run through so much of the Clean Air Act work, because they come up again and again in different programs, and I think it's sort of helpful to think as you plunge into this really complex area of law and regulation and policy that's been developing for half a century now, that there are some of these basic themes. So let me just take a minute. The first is the federal-state partnership, which is a phrase you might have heard of. Before the federal government got involved through the Clean Air Act in regulating air pollution was regulated by state and local agencies, smoke agencies and local health departments, and that system however robust or non-robust it was in different areas, was already in place when Congress plopped the Federal Clean Air Act down on everything. So there was a pretty clear understanding that a lot of the Clean Air Act work would continue to be done by state and local agencies. And indeed, that's the case. Most of the air permits in the country are issued by state permitting agencies. Most of the enforcement compliance work is done by state and some local agencies. And EPA is there to provide support, to fill in gaps, to do some of the things that have more national impact or require the kinds of resources that the federal government will be able to bring to the table that a state government probably won't. And oftentimes EPA and the states work in partnership on those things. There's also a approver-approvee relationship between the federal and state governments. Many parts of the Clean Air Act require the states to undertake planning or other activities, and EPA oversees that to make sure that the states are doing that consistently with the Act. And so that characterizes a lot of the work that goes on between EPA and the states. Okay, that's number one. Number two, new sources versus existing sources. The Clean Air Act tends to regulate at the federal level new sources, setting standards, for example, for new industrial sources, new motor vehicles, and that sort of thing, and leaves the regulation of existing sources more to the states. And I'll explain that more when we get into the implementation of the NAAQS in a slide or two. Another common theme throughout the Clean Air Act is that Congress required, when it set this up, that when EPA develops regulations or sets air quality standards, that there's a recognition that over time things will change. Our knowledge about the significance of and health effects and technologies and all of that will change as time goes on. And so it's important to build in a regular review and updating of regulations. So many programs under the Clean Air Act have that kind of requirement, and that is one reason that EPA is an agency that does so much rulemaking. It's because the Clean Air Act requires that on a regular basis, EPA review and, as appropriate, update regulations. Related to that is this notion of iterative progress towards cleaner air. And Peter mentioned how frustrated folks got that there wasn't enough progress on clean air. And this has been, it's been a long road since the 1970s to what is already much cleaner air, although many places still are polluted. But the Clean Air Act has laid out a path and a process for this iterative progress to continue to be made. States plan, they implement, they monitor, and if there's still progress to be made, they plan again and implement again. And then if EPA determines that an air quality standard needs to be tightened because there's health information that shows that there are greater health effects than they thought the time that they did it before, well, then the planning process starts again. So it is very iterative. I've made the comment already about lots of regulatory activity that's due not only to the regular review and updating of regulations, but also the fact that states have to develop plans and rules that have to be approved by EPA, and those require proposals and final rules. So lots of activity in the Federal Register related to EPA. The last theme or general point I wanted to make is that if you are involved in Clean Air Act litigation or advice or policy development or what have you, you need to understand and appreciate that you can't just read the statute and know what to do. You can't even read a regulation and know what to do. There are dozens or hundreds of other documents that may be relevant for specific issues, including policies put out by EPA. Sometimes those are called policies. Sometimes they are letters or determinations in response to a request from a state or a company or another group. interpretive documents. Much of the Clean Air Act has been, much of how the Clean Air Act is supposed to be implemented has been determined by case law over time. There's just hundreds of cases that have been brought over Clean Air Act actions by EPA and states over time. And then there are also administrative determinations at the state level and also with the Environmental Appeals Board. So there's a lot of homework to be done whenever you are looking to understand an issue or give advice to a client or somebody who's interested. So with those, let's move on. The first topic that I was going to talk about is picking up right from where Peter left off. EPA establishes national ambient standards for those 6 criteria pollutants, and then the states engage with EPA in a process to reach those standards. So the first step in that is to figure out which areas across the country do and don't meet the standards. If they meet the standards, great, that means the air is healthy there. If they don't meet the standards, that means that the air is not healthy there. Or that it's an area that is significantly contributing to an area where air quality is not good. So the states and EPA go through a process of designating areas that do and don't meet the standards. If you don't meet the standard, it's called a non-attainment area. If you do meet the standard, it's called an attainment area, or sometimes an unclassifiable area. You may see that term. Once those areas are designated, the states then are obliged to prepare something called state implementation plans, or SIPs, for those areas. And those are plans, I'll get into a little bit more detail in a minute, but basically that chart the path for how the state is going to bring pollutants down in the areas where air quality is poor. EPA reviews and approves those state plans or sends them back to the states if they are not sufficient. The states then go forward and implement those plans, and by implementing I mean that the states will have adopted rules and programs designed to reduce pollution, so they put those into effect. All along the way, they are assessing progress towards attainment, and then once they meet that health standard, they can apply to EPA to have that area redesignated to attainment status, which is called maintenance in those areas because they have been a non-attainment area, and so more attention needs to be paid to those areas to make sure that they don't regress back into a non-attainment status. So let's go to the next slide. This map shows you the recently designated non-attainment areas for the ozone standard, which was most recently revised in 2015. I would say that ozone and PM get the most attention when it comes to these issues because they are the most ubiquitous pollutants around the country. You'll see that California is the big winner or loser in this area. That has traditionally been the case. California is the most severely polluted part of the country when it comes to ozone due to a combination of huge numbers of cars and other emitting activities, and also a lot of the geography and topography in California that tends to concentrate air pollutants. There are also, it's a very populous state, so that means that many thousands of people are exposed to these high pollutants. Non-attainment areas, as I said, are either areas where the air quality is measured as not meeting the standard, or where there are activities that contribute to poor air quality. That could be industries, or that could be a very populous area with a lot of vehicle activity and other population-related activities that contribute to ozone. Typically, EPA will start with a metropolitan area and then either make that area bigger or smaller depending on the information they gather related to emission sources. In non-attainment areas, the Clean Air Act has certain mandatory elements that states need to have in place. They need to do inventories. They need to have permitting programs. They need to have monitoring programs and that sort of thing. In addition, there are certain pollutant reducing programs that are required for ozone areas particularly, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There are significant permitting implications. Actually, if we can go back, I'll just finish these last two bullets. There's significant permitting implications in non-attainment areas. The permitting requirements are stricter in non-attainment areas because you want to be careful about adding new pollution in an area that is already polluting. Likewise, there are transportation planning requirements, and interestingly, at some point, folks realized that states could put a lot of effort into reducing pollution from industrial activities just to find that highway projects or their transportation planning projects could overcome or wipe out all those gains. So states are now required to coordinate between the air agency and the transportation agency, especially in these non-attainment areas. So let's go to the next slide. These are some of the basic elements of an implementation plan: monitoring, modeling, looking forward and making forecasts to see what's going to happen to the emissions and therefore to the air quality, and also emission control strategies. Those could include federal control strategies. For example, cars are getting cleaner and cleaner because of federal requirements. States are allowed to consider those reductions because they are real on the ground, but they may also need to supplement those with their own reduction programs specific to those areas. Permitting for a non-attainment area requires, in non-attainment areas, offsets. So if you're going to bring a new permitting source in, you need to have a net zero impact. You're also required to use the most aggressive pollution control equipment that's available for that particular sort of activity, without considering the cost of that. So that's an important part of being a non-attainment area. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to need to pick up the pace, I can see. As I mentioned, EPA tends to focus on sources that aren't yet built, requiring generally very, very, very good control technology. And they leave it up to the states in these non-attainment areas to decide which of the existing sources can reasonably control their pollution. And reasonably controllable or reasonably available is a term that you tend to hear in non-attainment areas. The idea there being that when you're building something new, it's much easier, more efficient, and cheaper to build in really good technology. But if you have a resource that's, or a source that's been in place for many years, it would have to be retrofit, and that could be very costly and perhaps unreasonable in light of how much longer that industry is going to be around. So the idea is that states are in the best position to make those kinds of choices. These are some examples of the types of control programs that states might put into their programs: auto inspections, stage 2 vapor recovery, which was these fancy nozzles on pumps. That's mostly been overtaken by technology that's now built into vehicles, but back in the 90s, everybody was doing that. And in the lower left-hand corner is a picture of somebody doing a leak detection program at a refinery. So those are some of the kinds of things. Fugitive dust controls, as you can see with the picture of the trucks, is something that a state or local agency might use for a PM on a non-attainment plan. Let's go to the next one. Ozone and PM have a lot more detailed requirements, and I won't go into those except to say that for ozone in particular, areas are classified by how severe their non-attainment problem is, and there's a step ladder of required programs that states have to put in place. Again, this is the result of people being very frustrated that states were not making more progress to reduce smog across the country. As you might have noticed from the map that I showed you a few minutes ago, that the ozone non-attainment areas tend to be around big metropolitan areas. The more severely your area is polluted, the longer the Clean Air Act gives you to attain, and that makes sense because there's more requirements that need to go into place. And you can see from the graphic at the bottom that that what contributes to ozone is a large variety of things: stationary sources, mobile sources of all types. There are even biogenic emissions. That means emissions that come from natural things like trees and plants. And then there's lots of other daily activities, certain kinds of paints and coatings and glues and all that sort of thing that can contribute. Let's go to the next one. So I'm going to shift away from attainment planning now to some of the rules that EPA does. New source performance standards, or NSPS, are a major task for EPA, and EPA's job is to identify source categories that contribute pollution and to set standards for new facilities that are based on the best system of emission reduction. I've capitalized that there because that is a term of art in the Clean Air Act, and there's a bunch of case law defining what that is. Again, the idea is when we're building new things in this country, we should build them very, very clean, and then review and revise those as appropriate, because there will be, over time, increases or changes in technology that allow people to build even cleaner. So these are sort of two extremes of the kinds of industries that are affected by NSPS. One is a power plant, and many NSPS rules that apply to power plants of various fuel types. The one on the bottom is an outdoor wood boiler. So there is an NSPS for wood burning devices that people have in their homes or in their backyards. So these don't have to be big factories, but they can make a huge difference, and they're really important. The states all then incorporate these NSPS into their rules, and if you want to build a new power plant, no matter what state you're in, you have to at least meet the NSPS. There is a process for setting these standards for existing sources if those pollutants are not already covered by some other program under the Clean Air Act, like the non-attainment program that we just talked about. And that's under Section 111D of the Act. EPA sets guidelines and expectations, and then the states go through something of a SIP-like process for identifying specific requirements for existing sources. A 111D is the section of the Clean Air Act that was used for the Clean Power Plan, which Phil will talk about in more detail. Let's go to the next one. There are lots of questions relative to the NSPS. A source doesn't just mean a huge big power plant. It can be individual emitting sources at that power plant. You have to understand what a new source is. A new source actually is anything built after a proposal is put out for an NSPS, and the reason for that is a concern that that people would advance construction of new sources if they saw that an NSPS was likely to require more pollution control equipment. So EPA has made it clear that a proposal, after a proposal, you need to be on notice that you could be subject to new requirements. NSPS also applies to modifications. Those are considered like new sources because modifications often will result in an increase in emissions. This term modification comes up in various places in the Clean Air Act, and this is an example of where you have to be really careful about which kind of modification you're talking about, because it's defined slightly differently or maybe significantly differently in different places. So be alert to that. One of the best cases, but most well-known cases on modifications is what's referred to there, the WEPCO case. There are lots of exceptions to what is considered a modification, and there's been a lot of difference of opinion over the years about whether something was considered a modification or not. Let's move on to the next one. The next big program I wanted to talk about is Section 112, and that is the program for toxic air pollutants. And we might think that, well, any air pollutant that makes you sick is a toxic air pollutant, and that's certainly true. But again, there's a term of art under Section 112, hazardous air pollutants or toxic air pollutants refer to a specific list when the Clean Air Act was amended in 1990, Congress put in 189 specific pollutants that are considered hazardous air pollutants. There's an interesting history to this. In the early days of the Clean Air Act, EPA was to set standards for hazardous air pollutants based on a risk assessment, as you can see here, that's fairly complex. And it turned out to be extremely difficult for EPA to do that because it's just so hard with some of these pollutants to have the kind of information you need in order to do a risk assessment that isn't vulnerable in a legal challenge. So in 1990, Congress said, we're just not going to do it that way anymore. We're going to have a different process. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk about that. Rather than risk-based, it's technology-based. So EPA put the pollutant, or Congress put the pollutants in the act. EPA is supposed to identify the source categories that emit those pollutants and then establish first a standard based on available technologies, both for new and for existing sources of these. So maybe it's dry cleaners, maybe it's refineries. The EPA establishes those rules, and they're based on what's known as maximum available control technology. Sources would have, if they were being built new, they would have to meet those standards. If they were existing sources, they would have up to 3 years to comply. Those rules have to be reviewed and revised every 8 years. And required to come back and do a residual risk analysis to see whether the technology-based approach was sufficient to help reduce the risk. Section 112 is a very comprehensive approach to hazardous air pollutants. It has lots of other elements in it, and if you're interested, you can dig into that. Let's go to the next slide, which I believe is the definition of MACT. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I do want to point out that the administrator has to consider costs, has to consider other impacts. So perhaps you would require control technology that would produce a huge amount of water pollution or waste or something like that. It's fair for EPA to consider those. So let's go to the next one. Reasonable to ask, are we healthier? Are we safer as a result of these rules? And the answer is that we are. EPA does monitor, and the states do monitor toxic pollution in the air, as well as keep track of emissions from sources who are either required or asked to report those. And it produces something called the National Air Toxic Assessment Report, or NATA, on a regular basis. These reports tend to be out of date the minute they hit your local newsstand, because it takes so long to gather and quality assure this information. But what we found from the most recent one, 2015, is that a lot of the risk has gone down, and that the key pollutants that remain are related to mobile sources. They are, of course, ubiquitous across the country, so they are going to affect a lot more people. Industry hazardous air pollutants will tend to be more localized. So this program certainly is resulting in cleaner and healthier air across the country. Let's go to the next one. I wanted to just draw your attention to maybe one of the most famous of the rules done under this section, and that has to do with mercury and other air toxics from fossil-fired power plants. The rule was known as the Mercury and Air Toxics Rule. That was done in the first term of the Obama administration. It had a very long history. Power plants, of course, are highly regulated under the Clean Air Act, so there were some special requirements before EPA could do a toxics rule for power plants, and it sort of went back and forth from EPA to the courts and back again. It's a fascinating case study. It's also incredibly important in terms of reductions of mercury and some of these other toxics that you see, nickel and arsenic, particularly from power plants. I mention it also because although this rule was passed a number of years ago, was litigated and found to be okay, and has actually been mostly complied with, if not entirely complied with, by the industry. It is being relooked at by this administration and we may see proposals related to this appropriate and necessary finding up above. Again, it's very interesting if you're interested in more information, there's lots more available. But in the interest of time, let's move on. I think, Peter, if you could click a couple of times, I think I have, yeah, there we go. Transboundary air pollution is a significant element of the Clean Air Act. Of course, pollution does not comply with geographic or jurisdictional boundaries. So I live in the Midwest, and there's lots of pollution in the Midwest from our power plants and other industries that makes its way to the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region, and you have this all over. There are numerous programs in the Clean Air Act that deal with transboundary air pollution, and I'll talk about those very quickly in the next couple of slides. We can go to the next one. Peter mentioned acid rain. This is one of the huge success stories of the Clean Air Act. Congress actually put a cap and trade program into the Clean Air Act, which has resulted in hundreds of thousands of tons less SO2 and NOx over the years. And you can see the comparison, how much those emissions have gone down. Sorry if that's a little blurry. And also the improvement in the actual environment. So this is a success story, and this is one of the programs under the Clean Air Act that has cost a lot less than industry thought it would at the time when it was put into place. Let's go to the next one. A regional area can be smaller than an entire half of the country, and I'm showing here the one that I'm very familiar with, the Lake Michigan area, where the non-attainment planning there has involved Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan over time, and those states have had to work together. Likewise, the Northeast corridor, the I-95 corridor, is actually in the act. It is considered one single transport region, the ozone transport region, and those states have to plan together to make sure that they're all doing their part and that the things that they are doing are going to be effective, because emissions from Maryland are affecting all up and down the East Coast, for example. Let's go to the next one. There are a number of rules that EPA has put out specifically to deal with ozone and PM. The big one that people talk about is CASPR, the fourth one there. That was a highly significant rule that required reductions in pretty much all of the states that you see here to reduce regional air pollution. In 2016, EPA passed a next increment of CASPR called the Transport Update Rule. That CASPR set up a framework that was intended to be able to be updated as air pollution was measured and either improved or didn't improve over time. And that framework has been tested in the courts and proven to be fairly robust, I think. But you will see, if you follow these issues, you will see EPA working on these transport rules. And indeed, there have been a couple of petitions by states recently, Delaware and Maryland, I think New York, where EPA saying, EPA, you need to regulate upwind states even more. EPA has recently proposed to deny those petitions. And so we're in a comment period for that now. So these are very live issues. Next slide. I'll just mention regional haze. It's a distinct program in the Clean Air Act. Congress set a very ambitious goal. It focuses on national parks and wilderness areas and sets as a goal to return the visibility in those areas to basically pre-settlement conditions. Very ambitious. Congress gets to do those things, and then EPA and the states are charged with actually implementing them. They're very much state-by-state programs. When I was at EPA, we spent a lot of time looking at these state programs and trying to make sure that the states were applying the rules consistently and fairly. They are based on technology, but also analysis of how much visibility is being improved. And you can see these are real life pictures that show a very hazy day and a not very hazy day. This has been an important program for the West that did not have as much of the regulation already in place that the East Coast did. So a lot of the power plants in the West were significantly affected by the regional haze program. Let's move on. I'm going to have to move very, very quickly because I want Phil to have his full amount of time. Permitting is an area, if you're going to practice in this area, that's really, really important. There are significant differences between a construction permit, what you get before you build, and then an operating permit that governs how you operate afterwards, whether you're in an attainment or a non-attainment area, whether it's a new source or a modification. Some states have adopted things called general permits, which are for simple types of sources so that you don't have to do as much specific analysis. Those can be very good ways of simplifying the process. Permitting always, if it's anything significant, should have opportunities for public input. Deadlines are very important to remember. If you're working for a state agency or for EPA that's granting a permit, responding comprehensively to the comments that you get is really, really important. That's a great way to have a permit overturned is if the permitting agency just doesn't respond to comments that it got. Permits, let's go to the next one because I think these are the kinds of things that you would want to think about if you were looking to get a source permitted or advising somebody. So these are all things that you want to be thinking about, and you're going to be wanting to think about what are the pollution control opportunities that are out there. And the default presumption should be that if something is in standard use or technology is advancing and there are people using control technology, that's where you should start. And a permitting process will always go more smoothly and easily if the applicant is coming forward with the most up-to-date pollution control options and planning to use those. Let's go to the next one. These are the basic elements of a construction permit. Actually, the operating permits have these too. EPA has a catalog of policies related to new source review. It's not the super easiest thing to use because it just shows titles of documents, but there's the website for it. If you're looking for something, that's often a good place to start. Let's move on. In non-attainment areas and attainment areas, the permitting programs are different. It's called prevention of significant deterioration in the clean areas. And generally, sources 100 or 250 tons per year, depending on the type of source. That would be your trigger. The source is required to use something called the best available control technology and do an air quality analysis to make sure that it's not going to compromise local air quality. As I mentioned, in non-attainment areas, the requirements are stricter, including this emission offset requirement. And as you can see from the chart there, what the definition of a major source is going to be smaller in a non-attainment area. These are the ozone emission thresholds. So you want to make sure you know where you are and what size your source is. These major sources are based on what is the potential to emit, essentially the maximum potential to emit of the source before you put controls on. If you agree to restrict your emissions in a permit, that can lower your potential to emit. Let's go to the next slide. And that's what I just was talking about there. If you take those limits so that you get yourself down below that major source level, that permit is called a synthetic minor permit, which is one of the more fun bits of jargon from the Clean Air Act. If you want to get one of those permits, that can be helpful, but you may be trading flexibility in how you operate for having a minor source permit. Let's go to the next one. As I said before with NSPS, modifications are significant and a modification can trigger a permitting requirement, but the definition is different than for NSPS. Again, there are certain things that are excluded from considering a modification. Sources can also look at reductions they might have made in emissions over time and subtract those from new emissions. But those can get very tricky, so you want to make sure that you're being very careful about that and getting good advice if that's what you want to do. Let's move on. Operating permits under Title V. This was a major addition in 1990, and states all across the country were using different types of permitting documents. Some of them were much more robust than others. But these permits don't add new requirements. What they do is they bring all of the requirements together in one single document. They pay a lot of attention to compliance monitoring and compliance schedules. They are good for a period of time, and then they have to be renewed. So they're great for the source. They're great for the permitting agency, and they're also great for neighborhood or health groups who want to see all the requirements that apply to a source. Let's move on. Let me quickly just go through some of these motor vehicle things, and I think there's animation in these slides, Peter, so feel free to. We love cars in America. We have for many years, and we have millions of them. They make a lot of pollution everywhere, so they're highly regulated, and they've become much cleaner, so, as you will see. Let's go to the next one. The number of drivers, the number of cars, and the number of miles have all gone up in this country over the last 50 years by huge amounts. But if we go to the next one, you'll see that pollution has gone down drastically. The chart on the right shows how much fuel efficiency has gone up. One way to reduce emissions from a vehicle is to have it be more fuel efficient, burn less gas. But there are also technologies that can be added onto cars to reduce the pollution. It's a great success story. So let's go to the next one. I'm not going to go through every one of these because I'm running out of time, but there are lots and lots of issues related to Title II. Importantly, EPA's regulations apply only to new vehicles. States can regulate in-use vehicles, although it's very challenging. Americans do not like to have their cars messed with. And if you live in a state where there is emissions inspection only in certain areas, you will know that to be true. Very unpopular program. But EPA has very sophisticated abilities to improve how much or little pollution our cars emit, and have been doing that for years and will continue to do that. Let's go to the next one. I just wanted to take a minute on lead and gasoline. Phil already mentioned this, but the gasoline was the key source of lead in the environment. And if you go to the next one, you'll see that when lead was taken out of gasoline, the lead in our environment plummeted, and the lead in our children's blood also plummeted. And this is one of the greatest examples of pollution prevention. Just don't put lead in the gasoline. It doesn't into our bodies. The most significant source of exposure for kids to lead anymore is lead paint or residual lead in dust. A lot of that is due to vehicle emissions from years ago. Peter's right in terms of industrial sources. It's smelters. But if you're worried about kids and lead, you should be looking at houses built before 1978 and looking at whether they live in an area that might have lead in the dust. Let's go to the next one. There are significant sources other than cars and trucks that emit pollution. Ocean-going vessels actually produce huge amounts of pollution. It's partly because the oil that they burn is sort of the bottom of the barrel oil. And I think there's one more slide. Yeah, there you go. Modeling was done to show how far inland the impacts of ocean-going vessels can be detected, and you can see how far inland it is. So these ocean-going vessels are affecting the air quality in Indiana and Illinois. It just sort of boggles your mind. EPA in the United States does collaborate with other areas on trying to reduce these emissions, and we've drawn this little line, this emission control area, where we require lower sulfur fuel, which makes a huge difference. Let's go on. Aircraft are also a significant emitter. EPA does have responsibilities, but as you can imagine, that there's a considerable international interest in this, and the industry, of course. EPA does have to coordinate with the FAA, and this is an area where there's more that can be done, but it takes a long time to get these regulations in place. Next one. Non-road engines, Phil mentioned these. There are millions of them. They range from huge off-road vehicles to things like gasoline-powered lawnmowers. That's the word. And you can see here that the pound for pound, they can be significantly more polluting than vehicles. EPA sets standards for those, and there's a pretty massive compliance effort that has to go along with these, which are these things are essentially consumer goods, as you can imagine. So I think that is my last slide. Sorry to have both gone long and also quick, but I'll turn it back now to Peter for renewable fuel standard.
All right, thanks, Janet. I'll give you guys a really quick overview of one of the more, or what I think is one of the more interesting programs in Title II of the Clean Air Act. It's the Renewable Fuel Standard. It's highly controversial for a number of reasons. Everybody seems to have an opinion, and we're right now stuck in a period where I think a lot of different sides are trying to achieve reform, and it's not working. It held up at least 2 different political nominations. So this is something that's constantly in the news. Basically, in 05 and 07, Congress passed 2 different acts to address what they saw as a tremendous national security issue. Our trade deficit with crude oil and fossil fuels was significant. So we were importing loads of oil in order to supply our transportation sector with enough gasoline. So they said what we're going to do is we're going to mandate that a certain percentage or certain volume of the fuel consumed in the transportation sector must come from renewable sources. So they put statutory volumes that increase every year. They require EPA every year to set a percentage standard that applies to what we call obligated parties, and those are more or less oil refiners and importers of oil. And they have to make sure that a certain amount of their fuel contains renewable fuel. There are 4 categories of renewable fuel, and they're nested, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But you've got general renewable fuel, you have advanced biofuel, biomass-based diesel, and cellulosic biofuel. And the difference in these categories are essentially the amount of greenhouse gas reductions over a baseline that they can achieve, as well as some of the feedstocks. And when I say that they're nested, so the way that you generally comply with the program, if you can't purchase enough renewable fuel and blend it into the products that you're making, whether it's gasoline or diesel, you buy credits called RINs. And RINs may be on the next slide. Oh, there it is, at the very bottom. And RINs are not all equal. Some have multipliers. And so your cellulosic fuels, because they achieve the greatest amount of greenhouse gas reductions, you get the higher multiplier. And so those are a category of I believe it's a D3. You got a D3, a D4, a D5, a D6 RIN, and there's some D7s. But the smaller numbers can actually be used to satisfy the blending requirements for the higher numbers. So when EPA sets 4 categories, you know, if you were able to blend all your fuel with cellulosic fuel, you could use those RINs that you're able to obtain, and you can satisfy requirements for all other categories. And that hasn't happened because those types of fuels are very difficult to produce. So every year, EPA essentially issues a renewable volume obligation after they exercise their waiver authority. So one thing that happens every year about this time, and in fact today, EPA issued a proposed rule that's going to set the requirements to blend renewable fuel into transportation fuel for next year. So this goes out to comment. EPA takes a number of comments. I think last year's was north of 41,000. And they end up with a final rule that they pass sometime, or they issue sometime in November. And so that'll set the obligation for all obligated parties, and everybody will know in advance how much renewable fuel that they'll either have to physically blend in or purchase a credit. And this is a diagram of a RIN life cycle. So the way that a RIN, or renewable identification number, is generated, it occurs when a renewable fuel producer makes 1 gallon of renewable fuel. And at that point in time, they go through a process, they register with EPA, and they certify that they've made a certain volume of renewable fuel. And for every gallon, you get a RIN. And that RIN stays attached to the fuel until the point where it's blended. So usually somewhere, I don't have a pointer, but somewhere around the blender, when renewable fuel and conventional fuel is combined, whoever is responsible for blending can separate the RIN. And at that point in time, it's free to trade it on the open market. The people who need the RINs for compliance are as I mentioned it earlier, either the oil refiners or the importers. So there are certain situations where refineries or importers don't have the infrastructure or capability to actually blend the renewable fuel into their products. So they'll sell their products clear, and at some point in time, they'll have to obtain RINs and retire those RINs to meet their compliance obligations. So that essentially means that somebody somewhere else blended more than they needed, and then they're able to purchase those credits and retire them for compliance. And then obligated parties, sometime by March of the following year, end up filing attestations with the EPA saying, here you go, we've met our requirements. There are a handful of issues that have arisen with this program, some of which are very entertaining if you read some of the details. You get a lot of RIN fraud, which essentially means that there was somebody in their basement on a computer saying, hey, EPA, I generated a million gallons of renewable fuel, and they actually didn't generate any, and they end up selling the RINs to people, and eventually they're found out and prosecuted. There's pretty strict liability under this program. So if you're an oil refinery and you actually purchase fraudulent RINs, you're on the hook for replacing those. There's a blend wall issue with ethanol, and that's essentially the concept that our current infrastructure is set up to handle about a 10% ethanol gasoline blend, or E10. And then anything over that becomes really difficult for our country to absorb, either because a lot of cars aren't designed to run on fuel concentrations greater than E10, or because service stations aren't selling it, or there's not a demand. And so you get years where the blending percentage is actually greater than 10%. And so refiners and obligated parties will say, we have a really hard time complying with this because it's just physically difficult to blend past that 10%. So anything incrementally over that, we're going to have to get credits for. And as those credits become scarce, the price goes up, and obligated parties end up paying a significant amount of money to comply. Some of the other issues you've got are biodiesel blending in winter. During the winter months, because of the chemical and physical qualities of biodiesel, you can't use it when it's really cold. There are other disputes that are currently being litigated or haven't been litigated regarding the point of obligation. You know, who should be obligated parties? Should it just be oil refiners or others? There are issues with the small refinery exemption. What's the correct standard for demonstrating disproportionate economic hardship for those that Congress said could be exempt if they satisfied certain conditions. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, Congress had very lofty goals for the development of advanced biofuels and cellulosic biofuels, and thought that at this point in time that we'd be producing billions of gallons, and we've kind of fallen well short. I think EPA's most recent proposed volume for cellulosic was in the hundreds of millions of gallons instead of somewhere around 8.5 billion. So those are some current issues. I think that's my last slide, and so we'll give it over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Janet. I'm going to finish up our session today by talking about how greenhouse gases are regulated under the Clean Air Act. It's a story that's only about 10 years old at the start of this session. I think our Clean Air Act history started in 1950. The regulation of greenhouse gases is much more recent than that. So in addition to giving you a nice overview of the key regulations, key regulatory decisions, key legal decisions, some recent big changes that have been happening, I think this may be a nice way to wrap up, because you'll see some of the same programs that Janet and Peter mentioned earlier in the afternoon come back up again as applied to different types of greenhouse gases and different source categories of greenhouse gases. Really briefly, I work for the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. We are an association that has state and local air agency members. Those have been referenced a couple of times already today. Our members are the implementers that partner with EPA to actually make a lot of the Clean Air Act programs work on the ground. Our members are the folks that write permits. They're the folks that come up with state implementation plans, and in many cases, they're the folks that undertake enforcement activities. Before we dive into the regulations themselves, a little bit of background about greenhouse gases. Quite simply, they're gases that absorb infrared radiation, which then traps heat in the atmosphere. Not all greenhouse gases are created equal. Some are more potent than others. The table at the bottom of the slide lists 4 different types of greenhouse gases, and then on the right-hand column gives you their GWP, their global warming potential. These are all expressed in units of CO2. CO2 sets the baseline measure of how potent they are as a warmer. So of course, CO2 has a GWP of 1. Methane has a global warming potential 25 times greater, traps 25 times as much radiation and heat on a per ton basis, so that gets 25. Nitrous oxide, 298. There are a bunch of HFCs. Those can range from a GWP of 124 to nearly 15,000. There are others as well, but this just gives you sort of a flavor of what greenhouse gas air pollutants look like in general. If we start looking at the total US emissions profile, the most recent official data that we have from EPA comes from a greenhouse gas inventory that was finalized, I believe, just this past April. We saw that total US greenhouse gas emissions were 6,500 or so million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in 2016. So that number includes all of those greenhouse gases I mentioned earlier and then some. So if you measure 1 ton of CO2 in the inventory, that's going to show up as 1 ton in that 6,500 number. If you measure 1 ton of methane, because it's got a global warming potential 25 times greater, when that gets converted to CO2 equivalent, that will show up as 25 tons of CO2 equivalent in that number. Taking a slightly longer term perspective, the number for 2016 represents a 2.4 increase from the numbers that we inventoried for 1990, but an 11.1% decrease from 2005. So a positive downward trend in recent years. If we take that inventory number and stretch it out over time and then disaggregate it into industry or sector specific emissions, you can sort of see how where US greenhouse gas emissions have come from over time. Again, this is total CO2 equivalent, so all of our greenhouse gases are sort of embedded in this in common units. A couple of interesting features that are worth keeping in mind as we go through these slides. The first is to look at the top line, the purple line for the electric power industry. You can see a very pronounced downward trend in emissions from that sector from about 2005 onwards. As I said, we've seen that 11% more than an 11% decrease since then. The other is that for the most part, these lines are relatively stable. Like the rankings are fairly intact. You see a little bit of movement. The big change, a really significant one, has happened just this year, where you see the emissions level from the power sector actually dip a little bit below the transportation sector. So again, that's something to keep in mind as we go through these slides and talk about some of the policy choices that the previous EPA administration made and what we're seeing happen from this administration. As I said, this is a story that's about 10 years old. I think this is really the start of that story. It's a famous Supreme Court case you've probably heard of called Massachusetts versus EPA. It was decided in 2007. The genesis of the case was a group of states and NGOs filed a citizen suit against the EPA, arguing that EPA had an obligation to regulate greenhouse gases from mobile sources, and they'd failed to do so. A couple of things again to note here. We've learned already that the Clean Air Act has a lot of different tools to deal with different types of air pollutants from different types of sources. In this case, we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions from mobile sources, so we're in Title II of the Clean Air Act. EPA responded to the petition. They argued that they didn't have to do anything. They sort of had two big points. One, that greenhouse gases aren't actually authorized under the Clean Air Act. You can't regulate them. And then secondly, even if you could, even if you had the legal authority to cover them with the Clean Air Act, the causal connection between climate change and human greenhouse gas emissions wasn't strong enough or well understood enough to take action. At the end of the argument, the Supreme Court handed the petitioners, the state of Massachusetts, a big win and EPA a big loss. The big takeaways from this case that I'm going to emphasize today are first, that the Supreme Court held that greenhouse gases do meet the Clean Air Act's definition of air pollutant. So it rejected the argument that greenhouse gases can't be covered by the Clean Air Act. But they also spoke to the causal connection issue and said that, well, it's not enough for EPA to sort of make an informal determination that the connection is uncertain. They have to take a close look at whether or not greenhouse gases cause climate change, they endanger public health and welfare. And if the answer is yes, then they have to regulate. And that comes from the language of the Clean Air Act, this idea that the Clean Air Act looks for air pollution from sources that endanger public health and the environment. And if the answer is yes, you then have to take a regulatory action. So the end result of this case wasn't that EPA had to regulate, it was that they had to ask the question. They had to ask whether or not greenhouse gases met the endangerment requirements of the Clean Air Act. If the answer is yes, they have to regulate. If the answer is no, they don't have to regulate. Not a lot happened in the immediate aftermath of this case. That changed after 2009 when President Obama was sworn in. And in my mind, as I sort of think about how this sort of regulatory story has unfolded, I would argue that the first term of the Obama administration was sort of the first of three phases that we'll talk about today. This phase was really marked by the aftermath of Massachusetts versus EPA and all of the steps that EPA took following that decision to sort of make good on the obligations that the Supreme Court imposed and then follow through with some of the logical implications of that. So relatively not too long after President Obama's inauguration, EPA did take a look at the endangerment question and they answered it with an affirmative yes. They found that 6 anthropogenic greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare by causing climate change. I've listed them here. The first 4 you've seen on the earlier slide, and then there are a couple of other types of greenhouse gases that are mentioned here as well. Further, the endangerment finding found that combined emissions of these substances from motor vehicles, again, we're talking about Title II mobile sources here, contribute to harmful human health and welfare effects, including higher temperatures, more extreme weather events, and sea level rise. So this was the point at which EPA had to regulate. So Mass versus EPA said they had to take a look at the question of whether to regulate, whether there was an endangerment. In 2009, EPA determined affirmatively that there was, and so that they started to move forward with specific regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from specific types of sources. Again, we're talking about mobile sources. I've got sort of 2 tiers of bullet points here. These distinguish between different types of vehicles. You have one set of greenhouse gas regulations that applies for passenger vehicles and another set that applies to commercial trucks and buses, all of which have been issued separately by EPA in different rulemakings that have occurred at different times. The passenger vehicle limits have occurred in 2 waves or phases, the first in 2010 and the second in 2012. The phase 1 regulations in 2010 applied to model years 2012 through 2016. If you do the math, those fuel efficiency, fuel economy improvements led to an improvement of an average improvement of miles per gallon from 30.1 to 35.5 by model year 2016. So we've been through those standards now. Those are in the rearview mirror. We're now on the set of regulations finalized in 2012. That's phase 2. Those apply to model years 2017 through 2025. There again, when you do the projections forward, the projected fuel efficiency by model year 2025 is 54.5 miles per gallon. There's one other feature of these phase 2 regulations that we're going to want to keep in mind, and that's that the phase 2 regs require something called the midterm evaluation, which is a process EPA is required to go through to after the regulations are finalized, to take a look, take an assessment at how things are going, and to ask whether the model year 2022 to 2025 standards that were set again in 2012 are still reasonable. Should we leave them alone? Should we make them less stringent? Should we make them more stringent? That's an analysis that EPA is required to do under these regulations. For the commercial trucks and buses rule, phase 1 of that was finalized in 2011. The agency's estimates were that they would decrease greenhouse gas emissions 10 to 20% by model year 2018, although some variations between the vehicle model types that were regulated. Once the mobile source regulations were put in place, another kind of interesting feature of the Clean Air Act emerged, something that is often called cross-triggering. The basic concept is that regulations of an air pollutant under one type of the Clean Air Act can actually trigger regulations of that same air pollutant from different types of sources and other parts of the Clean Air Act. So in this case, this cross-triggering idea transitions us from the mobile source automobile regulations that we've seen in the previous slides to stationary source regulations. So things like power plants and industrial facilities. Now there were 2 programs that were implicated very quickly by this cross-triggering idea. You've heard about them both already today, the PSD program and the Title V program. We're not going to go into anymore on the mechanics of those programs, but the key detail to pay attention to are the applicability requirements, where in the case of the PSD program, there are 250 tons per year of any air pollutant, and for Title V, you had 100 tons per year of any air pollutant. So this kind of created a couple of practical problems. When greenhouse gases from automobiles became regulated as air pollutants, you had to sort of answer a timing question. Okay, so there are air pollutants under these new pollutants under these programs. When do they get thrown into these other programs that apply to stationary sources? So there's a timing question. There's also a much bigger threshold question. Greenhouse gases and CO2 in particular are emitted at much higher levels on a ton basis than any of the criteria pollutants that we're typically talking about in this context. So a 100 ton and 250 ton per year threshold works very well from a practical sense for something like NOx, where if you have a source that's emitting 250 tons, that's typically a big industrial facility. But if you're talking 250 tons of CO2, that could be a restaurant, that could be a small business. And so the practical consequence of this cross-triggering, programmatic cross-triggering, was that the number of sources that were swept up into both the PSD and Title V programs were in the thousands, and in some cases, some people estimated millions. So this created a huge practical problem for the agency. And so they answered both of these questions by issuing 2 new rules. The first addressed the timing piece. That rule was finalized in 2010. It found that greenhouse gases became subject to regulation on January 2nd, 2011, when the phase 1 mobile source standards went into effect. So that was a fairly clean, easy answer for the timing. Again, it's the threshold question that was the much harder one. EPA, via something referred to as the tailoring rule, instead of applying the statutory 100 and 250 thresholds for CO2, elected to create a much higher regulatory threshold that would make the number of permits much more workable, and pick 75,000 tons per year of CO2 equivalent. Once these rules were finalized, we saw the first big wave of litigation. EPA was challenged on everything: the endangerment rule, the mobile source standards, the timing rule, and the tailoring rule. These challenges went to the DC Circuit. Their EPA ran the table. They won everything. They won every issue across the board. Of course, the DC Circuit is not the highest court in the land. It got appealed at the Supreme Court. There, the Supreme Court decided to leave everything alone except for the timing and tailoring rules, and their EPA lost. The Supreme Court, in a case called the Utility Air Regulatory Group versus EPA, held that EPA can't tailor statutory emissions thresholds. They can't ignore 250 and 100 and use 75,000 as an alternative. That's not permissible. So as a result, the court further held that EPA can't require stationary sources to obtain PSD and Title V permits based solely on their greenhouse gas emissions. However, the court did allow EPA to require greenhouse gas permitting, impose greenhouse gas permitting requirements on sources that were already in the PSD and Title V programs. So though it was a loss for the agency, the practical limitations were pretty severely mitigated by that, just in an immediate regulatory sense, because the vast majority of the sources that would have been covered under the tailoring rules threshold were still covered because they were big sources that emitted lots of other stuff that was already included in the PSD and Title V programs. With that, I'll quickly mention AEP versus Connecticut. This is the third of the big three climate cases that the Supreme Court has heard. This is really here more for completeness. This wasn't actually a Clean Air Act challenge. This was a lawsuit that argued that companies needed to reduce their CO2 emissions because they were violating a federal common law nuisance limits. And there, the court simply held that because greenhouse gases are now covered under the Clean Air Act, those nuisance claims are no longer in play, so they threw them out. But what this case does affirm is that greenhouse gases are clearly within the jurisdiction of the Clean Air Act, and it's significant for that reason alone. Next, we'll jump to President Obama's second term. Here I have a screenshot from a press conference where President Obama revealed his second term climate action plan. Whereas in the first term, we really saw a suite of regulations that followed very naturally from Massachusetts versus EPA that focused on mobile sources, because that was where the underlying petition for Massachusetts versus EPA came from, to one much broader in scope. So in this next phase of slides, we're going to see EPA rules that target more greenhouse gases than just carbon dioxide, and we're going to see rules that look at more than just the transportation sector. So right away, the first big move that the second term Obama administration made was to go after CO2 emissions from power plants. There are two rules referenced on this slide. The first are the new source performance standards for new, modified, and reconstructed power plants under Clean Air Act Section 111B. Both Janet and Peter have referenced this section a couple of times already. This section requires the application of something called the best system of emission reductions. In this case, EPA's analysis determined that the application of a technology called carbon capture and storage technology would be the requirement for any new coal-fired power plants built in the US. The second rule, and the one that was far more significant practically, far more significant in terms of the coverage it generated, were emission guidelines for existing power plants. Those were issued under Clean Air Act Section 111D. This has been called the Clean Power Plan. You've probably heard of it. The BSER determination was a little bit different. It derived from the combined application of heat rate or efficiency improvements at power plants, generation shifting, whereby coal would be replaced by natural gas and renewable energy, and based on the combination of those three building blocks, led to state-specific emissions goals that states would then develop plans and submit to EPA for approval and then implement moving forward. The back-end estimates of the impacts of this program were that it would reduce power sector CO2 emissions to 32% below 2005 levels by 2030. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your perspective, the plan was not in effect for very long. It was stayed relatively quickly by the Supreme Court on February 9th, 2016. Which means that the Supreme Court issued an order taking the rule out of effect while legal challenges through the rule proceeded through the court system. And that's still where we are today. Once we got past the Clean Power Plan, we saw another full suite of greenhouse gas regulations that again expanded both the gases covered and the sectors that we were looking at. So the first I've highlighted, these are listed in a chronological order. In June 2016, the EPA applied Section 111 to methane emissions from the oil and natural gas sector. In August 2016, you had an endangerment finding for aircraft emissions. So there we're flipping back over to Title II, talking about mobile sources, the same way or in a similar manner that we had an endangerment finding for automobile emissions. In August 2016, we had an endangerment finding for aircraft emissions. Then in late August 2016, we got methane emission limits for existing landfills. Again, that's another Section 111 rule. In October 2016, we had a Phase 2 rule for greenhouse gases for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. And then on January 12th, 2017, we got that midterm evaluation that I referenced earlier, where EPA completed a process that it had bound itself to in its own regulations to evaluate how its mobile source program was going. And in January 2017, concluded that it was fine, everything was going well, and those 2022 to 2025 standards could remain in place. The timeline here is really worth paying attention to. Something fairly significant happened between October 25th, 2016, and then something significant happened shortly after January 12th, 2017. And it was the election and inauguration of President Trump, which kicks us into, I think, the third phase of regulation, which is a very pronounced change in direction from the push through the two terms of the Obama administration. My final two slides basically sum up where we are now on all of the rules that I mentioned previously. So, and these are more or less arranged in the same order if you want to flip back and forth to compare. So the first formal rulemaking we saw from the Obama administration, again in light of Massachusetts versus EPA, was that Title II mobile source endangerment finding. Thus far, no formal action from the Trump administration. It's been much discussed and speculated whether or not the Trump administration, the Trump EPA, will issue a rulemaking to change the endangerment finding. But again, nothing formal has happened there. For the mobile source standards, the Phase 2 limits, again, we're back to that midterm evaluation timeframe, 2022 to 2025. Even though the Obama administration issued its MTE in January 2017, very recently the Trump administration released its own MTE that replaced the Obama administration determination and instead concluded that the 2022 to 2025 standards should be revised. So the next step is to actually revise them. We don't have that rulemaking yet. We don't know what the proposed revised emissions limits will look like. But we do know that there is a draft at OMB, the White House Office of Management and Budget, for review. So we know that's happening soon, and that's something you should watch the newspapers for if you're interested, because we will be reading about it. For the first of the two power plant rules, the one that applies to new power plants, no formal action there. Although again, we're starting to see some indications that the agency is moving forward with a rulemaking to address that. We just don't know what yet. On the Clean Power Plan, we have seen some action there. It's happened on two fronts. The first front is a proposal to repeal the Clean Power Plan, and the second is an effort to replace the Clean Power Plan with something else. The proposed repeal was unveiled in October 16th, 2017, so we're still waiting for that to be finalized. So formally, the Clean Power Plan is still on the books. even though it's stayed by the Supreme Court, so it's not in effect, but it's on the books. On the replacement side, we don't have a proposed rule, but in late 2017, we got something called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, where EPA asked a series of questions from stakeholders to offer input on what a potential replacement rule should look like. So we're waiting for a proposal there as well, although again, some strong signs that something is imminent. In fact, while I was eating lunch today, I saw an email that indicated that a draft had been transmitted to the White House for review. So we could be seeing that soon as well. On the aircraft endangerment finding, no formal action there to amend or unwind that in any way. And interestingly, we're seeing some indications that the Trump administration is going to follow through on that and may actually issue emissions limits for aircraft following on the endangerment finding. For the methane limits for new oil and natural gas sector sources, early in the Trump administration, there were some proposals to stay those limits for 2 years. Those haven't been finalized. Instead, EPA recently finalized some small changes to the rule. So they are in effect, they've been modified slightly. And the expectation on the outside, I think, is that some bigger changes are in the pipeworks. We're just sort of waiting to see what a draft will look like there as well. Finally, the methane emission limits for landfills. That's another rule where EPA issued some delay rules early on in the administration, although they lasted only 90 days, so those have long lapsed. So those rules are back in effect, they're back on the books. But this is one of those programs where EPA sets the limits, states submit plans, and then EPA approves them, and then the state goes on and implements. And that pipeline is not currently running. And so a number of states have submitted plans to EPA. They've gotten no word back. And so as of a few weeks ago, we've started to see litigation over that. So these rules are all still very much in play. We can see very clearly that there's a policy shift between the previous administration and this administration, but in general, we haven't gotten far enough along to see what many of the substantive replacement rules are going to look like. So we're definitely watching for that. And then once those substantive rules start to be revealed and once they are finalized, the next step, which will also be tremendously interesting, is when those rules get litigated, and we then start to see if the courts may adjust or pontificate on the authorities that EPA has to regulate greenhouse gases. So we've got a few minutes left for questions, so I will stop there.
Perfect. So we'll start with questions in the room. Does anyone want to get us started? I can also start on the web while y'all are thinking. Let's see. So as the EPA adopts new rules, what authority does EPA or other regulatory agencies have to require existing permitted sources to comply with the new standards or rules or an amendment to a standard or rule?
Janet? If Janet, do you want to take that one?
I can give a start to it. So typically when EPA passes a rule, if it applies to existing sources, there's a period of time for that source to comply. And states do need to go back and amend permits to include those new requirements. So that's pretty well laid out in the Title V program.
Great. And then another question from the web was whether someone could explain what the secondary lead smelting is.
Sure, I'll take that. Primary smelting is when you're actually taking ore out of the ground and refining it into a metal. A secondary lead smelting is essentially when you are recycling lead and turning it back into a higher quality or more pure lead product. So think every time you change your car battery, that battery goes onto a pallet, the pallet gets sent to a smelter, the smelter breaks down the plastic shell, it takes out all the chemicals, and then takes the metal and runs it through a series of processes so that you end up with something that's really close to pure lead at the end.
Great.
So it's all, just think of it as lead recycling.
That's perfect. I think we have one more slightly longer question from the web. So someone says that this was a great presentation. They're a practitioner tasked with doing NEPA reviews for federally funded projects. She said, I would love to see data on average emissions of criteria pollutants generated by the following activities which my agency funds. So maybe you can talk a little bit about whether, maybe you can talk a little bit about, what the average emissions maybe not specifically are, but whether these are high emitting projects. And some examples that she gave would be for community centers, for new roads or sidewalks, for new parks. How would you go about assessing that?
Go ahead.
Janet, I'll let you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that that a lot of those kinds of activities are not subject to regulation under the Clean Air Act. They're not stationary sources that would be subject to NSPS or permitting. Mentioned that major transportation projects do have to go through this process called conformity, which is requires the transportation agencies to do some forecasting of emissions increases or decreases that are associated with, for example, adding lanes or that sort of thing, highway changes. The other sources can increase air emissions by the fact that they attract vehicular traffic, for example, like a new shopping mall or an airport or whatever. And those are great examples of projects that ought to be looked at from a NEPA perspective, because the Clean Air Act doesn't regulate them. So EPA would have less information on those kinds of activities, and they're very site specific. But if a project is subject to NEPA, some attempt will need to be made to evaluate the air pollution increases associated with those, if any. Peter, Phil, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll add something real quick. I mean, in those types of situations, and this is kind of a cheating response, but when we work with clients that want to propose a project that would be regulated under the Clean Air Act, we generally hire a consultant, and they do pretty substantial modeling. And I know if we'd had more time today to go into some of the details, I mean, that's a major part of the air permitting process, is actually going through and doing air dispersion modeling and figuring out what the potential, what the emission potential of a source would be, how far the pollution may spread, whether it will impact different air class regions. So I would imagine that you would kind of reach out to a consultant, and they would be able to put in the projected impacts of some of those projects. They could probably say how many cars would drive through on average, what they emit, and then they can model all that stuff out. So I know that's not a direct answer, but rely on a consultant.
No, that's perfect.
I have a question for Phil. I was just wondering, based on your personal experience, what are you anticipating with the new regulation from this administration, or if you have any expectations or concerns about what this new regulation might be?
I've learned not to speculate, at least publicly. But I think, so the big one that a lot of people are paying attention to is the Clean Power Plan. And as I said, I personally feel like we're still rather early in terms of the substance that we've seen from this administration in terms of replacements or repeals. Although with the Clean Power Plan, we have some pretty big hints. So I mentioned earlier that the BSER determination for existing power plants was based on three things: efficiency improvements, replacement of displacement of coal in favor of renewable resources, and natural gas-fired power generating resources. think actually I can join two building blocks there. So, but you have those activities that are happening sort of on site in terms of efficiency improvements, and then off site in terms of shifting generation around from different categories of plants. We don't have a formal repeal rule yet, but this administration has indicated in its proposal that it's going to redetermine BSER to limit it solely to efficiency improvements. And so that in a kind of macro sense is going to decrease the stringency of the rule and make it a lot easier to meet. And when we project forward what the reductions are going to look like, they will be less than 32%. So I want to give Janet a chance to say something though, in case she has a more nuanced view.
Well, thanks, Phil. Well, I think you're right that basically the indications are that if they come forward with a rule, it will be to limit the reductions to things that power plants can do on site, and not even everything that power plants can do on site. It's important, I think, to recognize, and there's a basic dispute that was joined in the legal challenge to the Clean Power Plan about whether it was okay under the Clean Air Act and under the definition of best system of emission reduction for EPA to include fuel switching and renewable energy possibilities as part of the BSER. And a lot of people wonder about that because it does seem kind of strange. And the underlying theory there is that power plants are just not like any other sort of manufacturing facility. They manufacture electrons, but it's as part of a very well integrated grid where everybody is tied together, and facilities are making choices to go to cleaner fuels as well as to do things on site. So I think that whatever they come out with, you can certainly expect to see a very rigorous comment process, and then legal challenges as appropriate if they interpret best system of emission reduction to be very much more constrained.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick question in the room.
So I was wondering about, you mentioned the CAFE and PRM that's at OMB, setting standards for model year 2022 through 2025. And there is rumor that the administration may challenge the waiver from California under 209B. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about how they could do that and whether they would need to have a formal act on the endangerment finding to revoke that waiver.
I would really like to punt this to Janet.
Thank you.
So these are really very, very timely questions. We certainly do expect that the agency is going to propose significantly rolling back the standards for 22 through 25. California has a waiver in place for its rules for that area. EPA would have to proactively take some steps to revoke it. And they would have to support that with new and different findings, saying that California didn't meet the standards under the Clean Air Act to be entitled to that waiver. Historically, California, for those in the room who may not be familiar, the Clean Air Act reserves regulation of motor vehicles to the federal government because they're national markets, with one exception, and that's California. And California can go more strict if they make certain findings that basically they need to preserve their air quality. And EPA has regularly done that and held and had a pretty low threshold as they felt was required by the Act and case law. So I don't want to write EPA's waiver revocation proposal for them in this seminar, but they'd have to look at what those findings are and make contrary findings and say that the basis for that waiver is no longer true, and the basis for the waiver has to do with environmental impacts, not whether we have one harmonized program or not. So that would be vigorously opposed, and I think people will spend several years probably in litigation over that, and they'd have to go through some kind of administrative process and give people a chance to comment on it.
And I just want to piggyback briefly to say that what Janet just articulated is a really good way to think about not just the California waiver, but the future wave of litigation challenges that we can expect to these Trump administration rulemakings, where you have, in many cases, a very robust record from the Obama administration. You have regulatory determinations backed up by a lot of data, a lot of thought, a lot of analysis. And under the Administration Procedures Act, the Trump administration, the EPA, is required to take on all those points and explain the reasoning for doing something differently. And so whether we're talking about the California waiver or the Clean Power Plan, where we have a little bit more information about which direction this administration may be going, that's the right way to think about how some of these legal challenges will unfold, and it's the right way to sort of evaluate how stable some of these future rulemakings will be.
Right. It's true of the CAFE standards themselves, because there's a vast record that of the technology they did on multiple occasions justifying the 22 through 25 standards. So EPA will have to build a record that supports a different finding.
Great, thank you both. So thank you so much to our audience in person and online today for joining us and for your great questions. We hope you'll continue to think and learn about the Clean Air Act. You can stay up to date with our summer school series on our website, eli.org. And next Tuesday, we'll be diving into CERCLA and RCRA at the Hazardous Waste and Site Seminar. Sign up today. An enormous thank you to our fantastic panel. Phil, Janet, Peter, your vast knowledge on these topics has been fascinating and informative. Thank you. We're so glad you joined us today. And thank you all again. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks.
You covered so much.